Story 1. The first time I saw the sign for my hometown in the distant mountains, a shiver ran down my spine. It had been years since I left, escaping the shadows of a place that held more memories than I cared to admit. My life had unfolded far from those peaks, in the bustling chaos of a city that was nothing like the quiet town I once knew. But something had drawn me back, a call from deep within, one I couldn't ignore any longer. As I drove through the winding roads, the landscape began to change. The neat, manicured highways gave way to rough, unkempt paths. The GPS, once my faithful guide, started to sputter and lose its signal. The trees closed in on either side, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I told myself it was just a quirk of the technology, but an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. The main road had become increasingly congested with traffic, and I felt the impatience grow within me. I decided to take a shortcut, one I had read about in an old travel guide. The path, long forgotten and barely marked on the map, promised a quicker route to my destination. It was a risk, but one I was willing to take to avoid the endless line of vehicles. As I veered off the main highway, the road quickly deteriorated into a narrow, overgrown trail. The foliage encroached on both sides, nearly closing in on the car. I noticed the GPS screen flickering erratically, the signal lost completely. The forest was dense and oppressive, the kind that seemed to swallow up any trace of civilization. The further I drove, the stranger things became. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, fleeting and elusive. Every time I tried to focus on them, they vanished, leaving me with an unsettling sense of being watched. The forest seemed alive, its silence heavy with a presence I couldn't quite define. I recalled the stories from my childhood about the forest and its secret tales of ghostly figures and inexplicable happenings. I had dismissed them as mere folklore, but now they seemed less like stories and more like warnings. My heart raced as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my mind racing with memories of the past I had tried so hard to forget. The path twisted and turned, growing narrower and more treacherous with each mile. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was then that I began to see glimpses of things that should not have been there. A flash of movement, a soft whisper carried on the wine fragments of my past I had buried deep. I saw the face of an old friend, long gone, fleeting among the trees. I heard the echoes of laughter that were now just distant memories. The forest seemed to be replaying the scenes of my past, taunting me with things I had tried to leave behind. The sense of unease grew stronger, and I knew I had to find a way out before it was too late. The deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. The path had all but disappeared, replaced by a dense thicket that seemed to close in around me. My attempts to turn back were futile. The forest seemed to shift and change, creating a maze that I couldn't navigate. Panic set in as I realized that the forest was not just a place, but a trap designed to ensnare me. The whispers grew louder, now clearly voices calling my name. I could hear them coming from all directions, blending with the rustling leaves and the distant calls of unseen creatures. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, my breathing becoming shallow as the oppressive darkness pressed in on me. Hours passed, or maybe it was days, I couldn't be sure. The forest had become a surreal landscape with shifting shadows and impossible angles, I stumbled upon a clearing that seemed oddly familiar. It was a place from my childhood, a spot I hadn't seen in years but remembered vividly. The memories came rushing back, each one more vivid and painful than the last. In the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated cabin. It was the place where my family had once gathered, where laughter and warmth had filled the air. Now it was abandoned and decaying, a ghostly reminder of what once was. As I approached, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a darkness that seemed to beckon me inside. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy with dust and decay. The walls were lined with old photographs and trinkets, remnants of a life that had vanished long ago. I saw my own face among the pictures, frozen in a moment of happiness that felt so far removed from the present. The shadows in the cabin seemed to come alive, moving and shifting in ways that defied logic. The whispers grew louder, filling my mind with incoherent murmurs. I felt a presence, something malevolent and ancient, watching me from the darkness. I tried to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me within the walls of my own memories. As I struggled to find a way out, the memories became more vivid and more painful. The forest had brought me here to face the past I had tried so hard to escape. The shadows took on forms, people I had lost, faces I had tried to forget. They spoke to me, their voices a haunting chorus that revealed the truth of what had happened. The forest, the cabin, the voices, they were all a part of the same twisted narrative. It was a place of reckoning, a manifestation of my guilt and fear. I had to confront the truth of what had happened, to come to terms with the past that had led me here. In a final, desperate attempt, I broke through the cabin's window and fled into the night. The forest seemed to close in behind me, its grip tightening as I ran. The path was still lost, but I could hear the sounds of the outside world, the distant hum of traffic, the faint glow of headlights. I stumbled through the underbrush, my heart pounding as I fought to escape the darkness. The forest seemed to fight back, the shadows reaching out to pull me back into its embrace. But I pushed forward, driven by a determination to escape the past and return to the safety of the world I knew. Eventually, I emerged from the forest, exhausted and disoriented. The road was there, a beacon of civilization in the midst of the chaos. I made my way back to the main highway, my mind still reeling from the experiences of the past few hours. As I drove away from the mountains, I looked back at the forest, its dark silhouette looming in the distance. I knew I had faced something profound and terrifying, a confrontation with the shadows of my own making. The forest had been a place of reckoning, a reminder that the past can never truly be escaped. My journey had ended, but the echoes of the forest would stay with me forever. The shadows I had faced were not just a part of the forest, but a part of me. And as I drove away, I knew that the forest would always be there, waiting, a silent reminder of the darkness within. Story 2. The old house in Ebonwood was a relic from another time, when my distant relative passed away, leaving me the property. It felt like a chance to escape my grief. My wife, Emily, had been the light of my life, and her sudden passing left a void I couldn't fill. The idea of starting anew in a place with no ties to our past seemed like a way to leave the shadows of her loss behind. Ebonwood, with its rustic charm and seclusion, promised a fresh start. The journey to Ebonwood was long, but the picturesque scenery offered a fleeting sense of peace. Rolling hills and dense forests framed the horizon, creating a calming backdrop as I drove. The house itself was an old Victorian, its once grand facade now showing signs of wear. Peeling paint, sagging eaves, and overgrown gardens marked its decline, but I saw potential. As I approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was silently observing me, waiting. When I finally arrived, I was met by the heavy silence of the house. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, almost as if it were trying to stifle your thoughts. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of mildew was strong. I began unloading boxes, each item a tangible piece of my past that I hoped would help me build a new future. The first night in the house was unsettling. I tried to settle into the rhythm of a new routine, but the old house seemed resistant to change. Strange creaks and groans echoed through the empty rooms. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but there was a disquieting edge to the sounds, as if something else was moving within the walls. The night was too silent, almost suffocating. I lay in bed, listening to the unsettling noises of the house. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window seemed amplified in the stillness. My mind was on edge, and sleep was elusive. I kept seeing fleeting shadows out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. As I tried to sleep, I was haunted by vivid dreams of Emily. In these dreams, she was calling out to me from the depths of an endless forest. Her voice was distant and distorted, full of anguish. I would run towards her, but no matter how fast I went, I could never reach her. I would wake up with a start, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The next morning, I noticed that a few items had gone missing. My wristwatch, a framed photograph. I was certain I had left them in specific places, but they were nowhere to be found. I attributed it to the stress of the move and the disorientation of settling into a new home. I tried to focus on unpacking and organizing, but the feeling of unease lingered. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences only intensified. I began to notice faint, muddy footprints on the wooden floors, though I lived alone. Doors would creak open and shut on their own, and whispers seemed to drift through the corridors, just beyond my hearing. I tried to rationalize these events, attributing them to the house's age and the wind moving through the old timber. One afternoon, while exploring the attic, I came across an old trunk buried under layers of dust and cobwebs. Inside, I found a collection of photographs and documents. The photos depicted people I didn't recognize, but who seemed hauntingly familiar. Their eyes followed me as I examined them, and an uneasy feeling settled over me. Among the documents was a diary, its pages yellowed with age. The entries were written in an erratic hand, describing strange occurrences and fears of an unseen presence. The writer spoke of a malevolent force residing in the house, an entity that seemed to feed on fear and despair. The final entries were a frantic plea for help, ending abruptly with the words, "They are here." Curiosity drove me to the local library, where I dug into the history of Ebonwood. The town's history was full of unsettling tales. I found an old newspaper article about a group of people who had vanished in the forest surrounding the house many years ago. The article was sparse on details, that mentioned strange markings found near their last known location. The local legend spoke of a dark force that resided in the forest, preying on those who venture to close. The stories described people who had disappeared or returned with tales of madness. The more I read, the more I felt a chill run down my spine. The coincidences between the legends and the strange occurrences in the house were too strong to ignore. One evening, I decided to explore the forest to see if I could uncover any more clues. The dense trees and undergrowth seemed to swallow the light, casting eerie shadows that danced with every movement. The deeper I went, the more disorienting the forest became. The path seemed to shift and twist, leading me in circles. That night, my dreams were plagued by vivid and terrifying visions. I wandered through the forest, searching for Emily. The forest was a nightmarish maze, and every turn seemed to lead to more darkness. I saw the mutilated bodies of the vanished group, their eyes wide with terror, and I was overwhelmed by a sense of dread. I awoke to find my room colder than usual. The footprints on the floor had become clearer, more pronounced. The house seemed to be mocking me, revealing its secrets bit by bit. I was determined to get to the bottom of these disturbances, but I felt like I was sinking deeper into a malevolent trap. The whispers grew louder and more coherent, forming sentences that warned me to leave. My investigation into the house's history revealed that it had once been owned by a man rumored to practice dark rituals. The stories spoke of a pact with an ancient entity that fed on fear and despair. The realization that the house's past was connected to the disturbances in my own life was both chilling and disorienting. Determined to find answers, I ventured back into the forest. The trees were even denser, their branches intertwining to block out the light. The path seemed to shift beneath my feet, leading me further into the darkness. I felt as though the forest was alive, guiding me towards something I couldn't yet comprehend. At the heart of the forest, I discovered an old clearing. In the center was a stone altar, covered in strange symbols and markings. The air was heavy with an oppressive energy, and the ground around the altar was disturbed. It was clear that something had been unearthed and then hastily covered again. I felt a sense of foreboding as I examined the altar. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift, almost as if they were alive. The realization dawned on me that the forest and the house were connected in ways I had yet to understand. My presence in this place had awakened something dark and powerful. As days passed, the phenomena in the house grew more intense. Objects moved on their own, and the whispers became more urgent, warning me to leave. My research revealed that the house had been the site of a dark ritual involving the summoning of an ancient entity. The rituals had gone awry, leading to the deaths of those involved. The more I learned, the more I realized that my own grief and despair had drawn me to this place. The entity thrived on suffering, and my presence had made me a target. The strange occurrences and the disappearance of my wife were part of a larger, more terrifying design. One night I discovered another hidden compartment in the attic, this one containing a series of old letters. The letters described the experiences of previous occupants who had tried to uncover the entity's secrets. Their accounts were chilling, detailing encounters with the entity and the madness it wrought. The diary I found earlier had mentioned a ritual that could break the entity's hold, but it required a personal sacrifice. The realization that Emily's disappearance and the strange phenomena were all connected to this dark force was a crushing blow. The ritual described in the diary was my only hope to end the torment. I prepared for the ritual, setting up the altar in the clearing. The forest was eerily silent, the usual sounds of wildlife replaced by an oppressive quiet. As I began the incantation, the air grew colder and shadows seemed to converge around me. The entity revealed itself, a monstrous, shifting form that defied description. The ritual was a desperate gamble. The entity's presence was overwhelming, feeding off my fear and despair. The air was thick with malevolence, and the darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides. I fought to maintain my focus, following the instructions from the diary as best as I could. The struggle was immense. The entity's form twisted and shifted, its presence suffocating. The ritual demanded a sacrifice, something precious, to break the entity's hold. In a final act of desperation, I took out a locket with Emily's picture. It was the last remaining piece of my past, and I hoped it would be enough. As I placed the locket on the altar, the entity roared in fury. The darkness seemed to writhe and twist, and the oppressive weight of the entity's presence grew unbearable. The ritual was taking its toll, and I could feel my strength waning. The entity's final act of vengeance was to pull me into its grasp, dragging me into the shadows. The entity's grip was cold and unyielding. I could feel my consciousness slipping away as the darkness closed in. The locket was my final act of defiance, a symbol of my love for Emily and my hope to end the suffering. As the darkness enveloped me, I felt a fleeting sense of peace, knowing I had tried to fight against the malevolent force. When the local authorities found the house, it was abandoned. The forest had reclaimed its secrets, and all traces of my presence had vanished. The diary, the altar, and the remnants of the ritual were gone. Ebonwood became a place of rumors and half-remembered stories, a location marked by its own history of horror. The house in Ebonwood still stands, a silent sentinel to the past. The echoes of its horrors serve as a warning to those who dare to uncover the darkness hidden within. My story has become a cautionary tale, a reminder that some secrets are best left buried. The darkness in Ebonwood has claimed more than just my sanity. It has taken my very soul, leaving me as a ghostly whisper among the shadows. Story 3. I had long ago left my hometown of Ravenswood for a bustling city life, far removed from the quiet, eerie landscape of my youth. But when I received the news that my grandmother, who had lived alone on the outskirts of town by the infamous Black River, had died under mysterious circumstances, I knew I had to return. The death of Ruth Collins, my last surviving family member, was a shock, and the timing was uncanny. I hadn't been back in years, and the memories of the place had faded into the recesses of my mind. Driving into Ravenswood felt surreal. The town was a shadow of its former self, the once vibrant community now succumbing to decay. The streets were lined with abandoned houses and overgrown weeds, a stark contrast to the lively place I remembered. The Black River, which had always held a menacing presence, was now even more foreboding. Its waters were unnaturally dark, and a heavy mist hovered above it, obscuring everything beyond its surface. I pulled up to my grandmother's old house, a dilapidated Victorian that had seen better days. The property was overgrown, and the windows were clotted with grime. As I approached the front door, I felt a chill run down my spine. The house seemed to exude an air of abandonment and sorrow, as if it were mourning the loss of its last inhabitant. The first night back was unsettling. The house was cold and silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you and fills the room with a sense of foreboding. I tried to get some rest, but sleep eluded me. Strange noises came from outside, like whispers carried on the wind and distant, mournful wails. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to amplify in the darkness, and I kept seeing fleeting shadows out of the corner of my eye. As I explored the house, I discovered signs of recent disturbances. The kitchen was in disarray, with overturned pots and spilled food. My grandmother had been meticulous in her habits, so this was unusual. I also found a journal in her bedroom, its pages filled with frantic scribbles and cryptic symbols. The journal mentioned dark rituals and the Black River, and as I read through it, I felt an unsettling connection to the past. The next morning, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The Black River was even more ominous up close. The water was thick and black, and the trees lining its banks seemed to lean in, casting eerie shadows. I noticed strange markings on the trees and remnants of what looked like ancient rituals, chart symbols, and faded runes etched into the bark. The town was not as I remembered it. The people seemed to live in constant fear. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously whenever the river was mentioned. The atmosphere was heavy, and the air seemed to pulse with an unspoken dread. That night I heard more unsettling noises coming from the river. I could hear splashing and dragging sounds, as if something was struggling in the water. The noises grew louder and more erratic, and I decided to investigate. As I approached the river bank, I saw a figure standing in the water, shrouded in darkness. When I tried to get closer, the figure vanished, leaving only ripples behind. The following days brought even more disturbing events. People began to disappear from town, their homes left abandoned, and their lives interrupted. Each disappearance seemed to be connected to the river, the strange footprints leading to its edge and eerie, unexplainable phenomena occurring nearby. The town was in a state of panic, and whispers of a curse began to spread. Driven by a growing sense of dread and curiosity, I delved deeper into my grandmother's past. I learned that she had been part of a secretive cult that worshipped ancient, malevolent deities. The cult had been linked to various disappearances and strange occurrences in the town's history. The rituals performed by the cult were said to involve the Black River, which was believed to be a gateway to the underworld. As I continued my research, I discovered that my grandmother had been involved in a particularly dark ritual shortly before her death. The ritual was meant to summon and bind a powerful entity, but something had gone horribly wrong. The journal I found contained references to an ancient tome that held the key to understanding the ritual's failure. I managed to find the tome in a dusty old bookstore in town. It was filled with dark incantations and descriptions of ancient deities, their powers, and their demands. The book spoke of sacrifices and pacts made with these entities, revealing the horrifying truth behind the cult's practices. That night, my dreams were filled with nightmarish visions. I saw myself standing on the edge of the Black River, staring into its depths, The water swirled with dark, malevolent energy, and shadowy figures emerged from its surface, reaching out to me. I woke up in a cold sweat. The images seared into my mind. The nightmares persisted, becoming more vivid and disturbing with each passing night. I could hear the voices of the missing townspeople, their cries for help echoing through the darkness. The dreams seemed to be a warning, a reflection of the malevolent force that lurked beneath the surface of the river. As I tried to make sense of the dreams, I noticed that the occurrences in the house were becoming more intense. Objects moved on their own, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. The presence in the house was becoming more aggressive, as if it were trying to drive me away or force me into making a fatal mistake. Desperate for answers, I returned to the Black River. I ventured deeper into the woods, searching for any clues that might explain the river's dark influence. I came across an old cabin, partially hidden by the underbrush. Inside, I found remnants of the cult's activities, candles, strange symbols, and faded drawings of the river. The more I investigated, the clearer it became that the river was more than just a physical location. It was a conduit for the ancient deities worshipped by the cult, a gateway to a realm of darkness and despair. The river had become a place of power, drawing those who were susceptible to its influence and feeding off their fear. In the cabin, I found a hidden compartment containing a collection of old photographs and letters. The photographs depicted my grandmother and other cult members performing rituals by the river. The letters described their attempts to summon and control the entity, detailing the sacrifices made and the consequences of their actions. Determined to end the terror, I decided to perform a ritual to banish the entity and close the gateway. I followed the instructions in the tome, setting up the ritual in the clearing by the river. The ritual required specific ingredients and precise incantations, and I worked through the night determined to put an end to the suffering. As I began the ritual, the atmosphere around the river grew oppressive. The water churned and roiled, and the shadows seemed to come alive, moving with a sinister purpose. The air was thick with malevolence, and the whispers grew louder, as if the entity was trying to disrupt the ritual. The ritual was a desperate gamble. I chanted the incantations, my voice trembling with fear and determination. The river's surface erupted in a violent maelstrom, and the shadows converged around me. I felt a cold, crushing force press against me, trying to pull me into the depths of the river. The final moments of the ritual were a blur of terror and desperation. The entity revealed itself, a writhing mass of darkness and malevolence. It seemed to feed off my fear, growing stronger as I faltered. The ritual's demands were exacting, and I struggled to maintain my focus. As the entity closed in, I realized that my grandmother's death and the strange occurrences were all connected to the entity's influence. The river had become a source of its power, and my attempts to banish it were the last hope for ending the nightmare. With a final, desperate effort, I completed the ritual. The river's surface exploded in a blinding flash of light, and the entity let out a final, deafening roar. The darkness receded, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted, leaving behind a silence that was both relieving and unsettling. The next morning, the river was eerily calm, its dark waters now a murky gray. The town was still, and the air felt lighter. The disappearances ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued Ravenswood seemed to have lifted. However, the victory came at a great cost. The ritual had taken a toll on me, leaving me physically and emotionally drained. The once familiar town now felt alien and distant, as if I had been forever changed by the events that transpired. The house was still there, a somber reminder of the dark past. I decided to leave Ravenswood behind, unable to shake the feeling that the river's dark influence would always be a part of me. The memories of my grandmother, the disappearances, and the rituals would remain with me, a haunting reminder of the horrors that lurk in the shadows. Ravenswood gradually returned to its quiet existence, the shadow of the Black River still looming over it. The town's history was marked by the darkness that had been uncovered, a reminder of the ancient evils that had been disturbed. The river remained, its depths a mystery, and its surface a reflection of the shadows that lingered. I moved on, but the experience left a permanent mark on me. The darkness of the Black River had revealed itself in ways I could never have imagined, and I knew that some secrets are better left buried. The river's malevolence had been subdued, but its legacy lived on, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can dwell within the heart of even the most peaceful places. Story 4. The news of my father's death reached me like a crushing weight, pulling me back to my childhood home in the small town of Oak Ridge. I hadn't been back since I left for college years ago, and the memories of the place were now a distant echo. The thought of organizing his funeral and settling his affairs was overwhelming, but it was something I had to do. Oak Ridge was as I remembered it, a quaint, sleepy town surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills. The house I grew up in was just as I'd left it, though it had clearly aged in my absence. As I started to sort through my father's belongings and make funeral arrangements, a sense of melancholy settled over me. Everything seemed to be imbued with a quiet sadness, as if the town itself was mourning the loss of one of its own. While handling the estate, I came across a box of old photographs and documents in the attic. Among them was a faded map of the town, with a location marked in red that I didn't recognize. It seemed to point to a place on the outskirts, deep in the forest that bordered the town. My curiosity was piqued, and I decided to investigate. One crisp autumn afternoon, I ventured into the woods, following the map's directions. The forest was eerily quiet, with only the crunch of leaves underfoot breaking the silence. After a long trek, I stumbled upon an old wrought-iron gate partially hidden by overgrown vines. Beyond it lay a neglected graveyard, its headstones weathered and nearly illegible. The sight of the graveyard was both intriguing and unsettling. It was clearly abandoned, with no signs of recent maintenance. The graves were sunken and overgrown with weeds, and a thick fog clung to the ground. The atmosphere was heavy with a sense of foreboding, and I felt an inexplicable chill as I stepped through the gate. As I began to explore the graveyard, I noticed that the air was unnaturally cold, and the fog seemed to swirl around me as if it had a life of its own. I took several photographs of the site, hoping to capture some of its eerie charm. When I reviewed the photos later, I was shocked to see that many of them contained strange, indistinct silhouettes, figures that seemed to hover over the gravestones, their shapes unclear. The sounds of the forest were unsettling too. Occasionally, I heard distant whispers and muffled voices that seemed to come from nowhere. As night fell, the graveyard took on a more sinister quality. The shadows grew deeper, and the air was filled with an oppressive silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The following nights were plagued by disturbing visions and nightmares. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, as I tried to shake off the feeling of being trapped in a suffocating darkness. In my dreams, the graveyard was always there, its foggy, desolate landscape a backdrop to my fears. I saw figures moving among the graves, their faces obscured by shadow. The disturbances in the graveyard intensified. Objects seemed to move on their own, and the sounds of scratching and shuffling came from beneath the ground. I began to feel a growing sense of dread every time I approached the site. The atmosphere was charged with an almost palpable malevolence, and it felt as if the graveyard itself was alive, feeding off my fear. Driven by my escalating fears, I decided to delve into the history of the graveyard. The local library had a collection of old records and documents, and I spent hours poring over them. The more I uncovered, the more disturbing the history became. The graveyard dated back to the early days of the town's settlement. It was used for rituals and ceremonies by a group of settlers who practiced dark magic. The records detailed how the settlers believed that the land was cursed and that the graveyard was a site of powerful, malevolent energy. They had performed numerous rituals to appease the spirits they believed haunted the area. The more I read, the more I realized that the graveyard was not just a burial site, but a focal point for dark energies that had been harnessed by the settlers. The rituals had involved sacrifices and conjuring of spirits, and it seemed that the graveyard was a gateway to something far more sinister than I had imagined. As my investigation deepened, I became increasingly obsessed with the graveyard. My days were spent researching, and my nights were plagued by nightmares that grew more vivid and terrifying. I felt as if I was being drawn into the darkness, unable to escape the pull of the graveyard's malevolent influence. One night I decided to spend the entire night in the graveyard, hoping to confront whatever was haunting me. As I sat among the graves, the air grew colder, and the fog thickened. The shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing in the dim light of my flashlight. I heard whispers in my ear, but when I turned around, there was no one there. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of despair. The voices grew louder, and I could make out fragments of words, cries for help, pleas for release. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, and I felt as if I was sinking into the earth. The experience was disorienting and terrifying, and I struggled to keep my grip on reality. In my search for answers, I came across a journal hidden in the library archives. It belonged to one of the original settlers, and it detailed the final, disastrous ritual performed in the graveyard. The ritual had been intended to summon and control a powerful entity, but it had gone horribly wrong. The entity had escaped its bindings, and the settlers had been doomed to a fate of eternal torment. The journal described how the entity thrived on fear and suffering, and how the graveyard had become a prison for both the settlers and their victims. The entity had the power to manipulate reality and trap those who venture to close feeding off their deepest fears and insecurities. As I read the journal, I realized that the graveyard was not just a site of dark magic, but a living entity in itself. It was actively trying to ensnare me, using my fears and traumas against me. The more I uncovered, the more I felt my grip on reality slipping away. Determined to break free from the graveyard's grip, I made one last attempt to escape. I packed my belongings and prepared to leave Oak Ridge, hoping that distancing myself from the site would end the nightmare. But as I packed, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The shadows seemed to follow me, and the whispers grew louder. The night before my departure, I was drawn back to the graveyard. The fog was denser than ever, and the air was filled with an oppressive weight. I could feel the entity's presence, its dark energy swirling around me. I tried to fight it, to break free from its influence, but it was as if the graveyard had a hold on me that I couldn't escape. As I made my way through the graves, I saw the figures from my nightmares materialize before me. They were the souls trapped in the graveyard, their faces contorted in agony. They reached out to me, their hands grasping at my clothes, their voices echoing in my ears. The entity was drawing me in, its power overwhelming. In a final, desperate act, I tried to burn the journal and destroy the remnants of the dark rituals. I hoped that by erasing the evidence of the entity's power, I could break its hold. But the fire was quickly extinguished by an unnatural wind, and the shadows grew darker and more aggressive. The graveyard's grip on me tightened, and I felt myself being pulled into the earth. The ground seemed to open up beneath me, and I was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing I saw was the fog swirling around me, the faces of the lost souls staring up from the graves. In the end, I became part of the graveyard's eternal torment. The entity's darkness consumed me, and I was trapped in a nightmarish cycle, forever bound to the place that had claimed so many before me. The graveyard's malevolence had claimed me, and I was now one of its lost souls, doomed to wander among the graves for all eternity. The town of Oak Ridge eventually faded into obscurity, its secrets buried along with the forgotten graveyard. The few who remembered the stories spoke of a cursed place, a land of shadows and despair that no longer existed in the world. But the darkness of the graveyard lived on, a haunting reminder of the fears and traumas that had claimed so many lives. The legend of the forgotten graveyard became a cautionary tale, a warning to those who would dare to explore the unknown. The entity's power remained, a silent force lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. And somewhere, in the depths of the graveyard, I remained a part of the darkness that had claimed me, forever bound to the place of eternal night. Story 5. My name is Caleb, and I live in a small, remote village in the United States. It's a place where the biggest excitement usually revolves around the annual fair or a new grocery store opening. Our village, nestled in the shadow of towering mountains, was a quiet, sleepy place until the construction began on the old industrial site at the edge of town. The site had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. It was a sprawling mess of rusted machinery, broken concrete, and overgrown weeds. The old factory was a relic from another era, and everyone had long forgotten it. But then, one day, construction vehicles began rolling in, and the site was buzzing with activity. I was 12 years old at the time. At first, the change seemed like a good thing. The workers promised new jobs and improvements to our crumbling infrastructure. The adults in the village talked excitedly about the new opportunities, but I felt uneasy about the whole thing. There was something unsettling about watching the old factory come back to life, as if we were awakening something that should have stayed buried. It was a hot summer night when it all started. I was outside playing with my friends, running through the fields behind my house, when I felt a strange shiver run through my body. At first I shrugged it off as nothing more than the heat, but by the next morning I was feeling nauseous and weak. My skin had developed a strange rash with patches of yellowish discoloration. My parents were worried and took me to the local clinic. The doctors were baffled. They couldn't identify the cause of my symptoms and suggested it might be a rare skin condition or an allergic reaction. They prescribed some creams and medications, but nothing seemed to help. Instead, the rash worsened, and I began to experience other, more disturbing changes. Over the next few days, the symptoms intensified. My skin not only changed color, but also developed an unusual texture, almost like it was covered in a fine mesh of veins and ridges. My limbs seemed to elongate and become more flexible, and I could feel something shifting beneath the surface of my skin. It was as if my body was in the middle of a grotesque transformation. The changes were horrifying. I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger staring back at me. My face was becoming more angular, my eyes more deeply set, and my mouth seemed to stretch into a permanent, unsettling grin. I was losing control over my body. I could no longer walk steadily, and my movements were becoming jerky and unnatural. My parents were beside themselves with worrying. They took me to specialists in the nearby city, but none could explain the extent of my condition. I became a source of fear and curiosity for the townsfolk. Whispers followed me wherever I went, and I could see the fear in their eyes. As my condition worsened, I began to isolate myself. I avoided going outside, spending most of my time locked in my room. The few friends I had were scared to come near me, and my once close relationship with my family became strained. They tried to be supportive, but their fear and confusion only made me feel more alone. In my isolation, I turned to the old library in the village. I spent hours poring over books and newspapers, searching for any information that might explain what was happening to me. That's when I came across some old records about the industrial site. It was said that the site had once housed a laboratory where dangerous experiments were conducted. The lab had been shut down abruptly, and the site was abandoned, but it seemed that the chemicals used in those experiments had been left behind. Determined to find answers, I decided to investigate the construction site. One night I snuck out of the house and made my way to the site, which was now a labyrinth of machinery and half-built structures. I found a partially buried archive of documents and records detailing the experiments conducted at the laboratory. The experiments involved toxic chemicals with unknown properties, which had led to severe contamination. The records describe strange and horrifying effects on living organisms, including grotesque mutations and psychological disturbances. It was clear that the chemicals had caused severe damage. But what shocked me was the mention of the lab's attempts to conceal their failures. The more I read, the more I realized that my condition was directly linked to these toxic substances. As my transformation progressed, I began to experience strange phenomena. My senses became extraordinarily sharp, and I developed an unsettling ability to perceive things that were normally invisible. Shadows seemed to whisper to me, and I could hear distant, eerie noises that no one else could. My dreams turned into horrifying visions of dark, twisted landscapes and monstrous beings. The village was becoming increasingly hostile. Rumors spread about my condition, and people began to avoid me entirely. My parents were desperate for a solution, but their attempts to seek help only led to dead ends. Specialists refused to see me, and those who did were either frightened or unable to offer any assistance. I realized that my only chance of finding a cure was to confront the source of the contamination directly. I returned to the construction site, determined to find something that might reverse the effects of the toxins. I searched through the ruins of the laboratory, hoping to find some clue or antidote. During my search, I stumbled upon an old, hidden chamber beneath the laboratory. Inside, I found a collection of ancient texts and artifacts related to occult practices and dark rituals. It seemed that the experiments conducted at the lab had involved not only toxic chemicals, but also rituals meant to harness dark, supernatural forces. The texts reveal that the laboratory had been conducting experiments to bridge the gap between the physical and supernatural worlds. The chemicals used were intended to alter human physiology to make it more compatible with these dark forces. The more I read, the more I realize that my transformation was not just a physical change, but also emerging with something malevolent and otherworldly. As I continued to investigate, I felt a growing sense of dread. The more I learned, the more I felt myself losing my grip on reality. My physical changes became even more pronounced, and I began to lose my sense of self. The line between my human identity and the monstrous entity I was becoming blurred. One night I had a vision of the dark forces that had been awakened by the experiments. They were ancient, malevolent entities that thrived on fear and suffering. The vision showed me that the toxic chemicals had acted as a gateway, allowing these forces to influence and corrupt the living. I felt an overwhelming sense of hopelessness as I realized that there was no escaping my fate. My attempts to find a cure were futile, and the darkness was closing in. I had become a vessel for these malevolent entities, and my transformation was complete. The village eventually forgot about me, as if I had never existed. My family moved away, and the construction site was abandoned once more. The villagers spoke of the boa who had vanished, but no one knew the truth about what had happened. I am now a part of the darkness that once consumed me. My humanity is lost, and I am forever trapped in a state of monstrous existence. I can see the village from afar, but I can no longer interact with the world I once knew. My transformation has left me a twisted reflection of what I once was, a reminder of the dangers hidden in the shadows of forgotten places. My story is a warning about the unknown dangers that lie beneath the surface. Sometimes curiosity can lead to horrifying consequences, and the darkness that lurks in forgotten corners of the world can consume even the most innocent of souls.